Thank you so much, panelists, for such amazing presentations. We've had really great questions already coming up in the chat, and actually some of the panelists responding. So it's been, really active. So everyone should take a look at that chat. But maybe we can go back to a question that was raised pretty early on from Jason Curtis. Jason was commenting on Alden's presentation, asking, are the payments to farmers one-time or annual? And so maybe we can talk a little bit about that, but there's also some really great questions that generally pointed to the question of, can small farmers do this and make any money? So maybe we can have a little bit of a bigger discussion about, including also maybe pulling in a question that Hannah Gold asked just a few minutes ago, saying, is this a model geared mostly towards big business? Other than businesses needing to offset carbon emissions, do you see partaking, who do you see partaking in this system, and how do you incentivize this model? So to this question of scale that Ben was just talking to, Alden, Ben, or any of the other panelists, do you want to take that on?
I think the key message I wanted to get across in my chat response to the question about once a year is the answer to that question is very, very different depending on which carbon offset market you're looking at. The protocols or methodologies in the Verra Climate Action Reserve, American Carbon Registry, CARB, and NORI markets are quite different. And when you dive into them, you need to pay attention to not just how carbon removal and retention is quantified, where the estimates come from, but also how credits are issued and what restrictions there might be on your credit sales. In our market, the farmer has the right to sell any credits they earn in the year they are issued. Sorry, in the year they are issued.
I've done this since 2 o'clock, sweetheart.
Oh, and but that's different in other markets.
Ben, did you want to weigh in on this question? Yeah,
I would be happy to. I was born on a very small farm that was highly, in a good way, carbon intensive, farm with horses and compost. But the problem is that in countries like the US, we have small farms take up a very small % of our acreage at this point in time. So I think depending on what country you're in, it very much, and what your cultural context is, scale is the key question, like I was alluding to in the end of my talk. If you're in a rice system where there are thousands of farmers adjacent running small plots that all aggregate into one, then especially in developing countries where money can go a lot further than here in the States, I think small farmers have a critical role, and that carbon credits could help them. The problem is getting them registered and verified in an effective way. And the other problem we're facing is that carbon prices are too low right now. If carbon were being traded at $100 a ton or more, then I think then it would really have a good effect on small farmers. But right now, with carbon being traded between $8 and $20 per ton, it really has more impact for larger scale operations. And in our launch of our Hudson Carbon platform, we're selling carbon at 100 a ton because we've done direct measurements for several years now. So we feel we can really accurately represent our carbon. The other part of that is we want to set precedent that if there isn't a high carbon price, it's not really going to address the problem. The oil companies and airlines are setting very self-serving low prices for carbon. And we need to address this with a higher carbon price, and then that makes space for smaller farms to actually see something meaningful out of a carbon platform in the future.
Thank you so much. We have a question from Dean Hoffman. Dean Hoffman, would you like to ask your question about data?
Oh, I had a question actually for Ben. Thank you. That actually is a good follow-up to what you're just saying. Also, Alidan, the idea of aggregating farms. I mean, small farms can become larger farms at scale. if there's a process of aggregating those farms like we've done for a variety of different farming ventures. So the idea of creating scale, for the smaller farmers, and who's doing that and what's the future there? Very general question. Thank you.
So
Could I, oh, sorry.
Go ahead.
Could I jump in and say that we started working on mobilizing a carbon market for farmers in Canada in the late 1990s, early 2000s. And when we started in the 1990s, it was probably fair to say that lower tillage and 2 or 3 crop rotations was maybe 10% of the crop acres we were looking at. And today they're at about 55%. And I'm of the view that the single largest factor for that relatively fast adoption of new practices was central Canadian farming communities' great comfort with the business model known as the co-op. And when you get to co-ops, it's not just about getting to scale. Most farmers, if you buy a tractor, you're not profitable enough to take advantage of the depreciation. If a bunch of farmers own a co-op and the co-op buys the tractor and the tractors are leased to the owners are able to use the depreciation to shelter profits in the co-op. So once you start thinking co-op, it's not just scale, all sorts of different tax and cost sharing opportunities arise that don't necessarily come to mind before you start going down that road. So there are regions in Saskatchewan right now where there isn't a single farmer I know in those regions who ever buys a tire. They always lease a tire through the co-op because that's how you maximize the depreciation. So go for it.
I wanted to say that, but Alden's answer really connected to mine, which is the real issue is that how do we connect small farmers, and doing that through marketing of products. So for example, we're working with a group of small grass-fed dairy farmers, and aggregating them because their practices are very similar will be a key project in the coming 2 years for our carbon platform. And then when you get into countries, foreign countries, where if you have many adjacent rice farmers or smallholder farmers in India, many of these groups are already in farmers association and cooperatives, and working with that's the best way to get to the most people. I worked for a while in the Dominican Republic buying coffee from organic coffee cooperatives. And again, some of the smallest growers had a half a hectare of coffee. Some had 10 or 15. But again, these groups represent a much larger land base. And it's really important that we address it from both sides. In countries like the US and Canada, farmers have much more land, and a lot could address, if they change practices, it makes a lot happen fast. But often the outputs of their systems are going through a very industrial process to make food, and a lot of emissions, even if there's good practices on making the corn in say Iowa, if that corn ends up being made into ethanol, that's not very helpful to our climate. So small farmers are critical because their food supply chain often ends up getting directly to people, often in the fastest possible way. So bringing them in with some extra carbon revenue to sustain them is critical, because these small farmers are in a world where robotics are taking over our workforce. We need a role for small farmers. And small farmers are, especially in developing countries, still critical and to their supply chain. And their sovereignty. So finding a way to work with co-ops, existing groups, and help farmers get on the map is critical. I don't have all the answers though, but I just would say that for our food system and for climate emissions reduction, we need to look at how to engage the small farmers.
Thank you.
Great. If we can turn to a question for Dr. Jen Wilcox. This one is from Oliver Atwood. Oliver, I know you had a few questions here, but do you want to pick one of your questions for Dr. Wilcox?
Yeah, I can ask them here in public. Why not? Just scrolling back through the chat to get to it.
There was one
Dr.
about the role
Wilcox,
of fossil fuel companies, but
yeah. So she gave a really good answer in the chat, but I can, raise that again here. The question was, how do you see the role of fossil fuel companies in a world with appropriate carbon pricing that would incentivize sequestration? How could these companies reasonably become carbon management firms using extant knowledge from fracking and EOR to inform sequestration efforts? Or is this just a pipe dream? As a follow-up, how could the future carbon sequestration be more democratized and less concentrated in the hands of massive industry players? So kind of a multi-part question, but
I'm happy to reflect on that for a little bit. In my talk, I discussed a little bit of the conclusions from National Academy of Sciences study that I was a co-author on that we released in January in 2019. And in that, one of the conclusions was that, of course, we all kind of are on the same page with this, is that we need carbon removal in addition to avoiding carbon emissions in order to meet climate goals. And the numbers that we concluded were between now and 2050, roughly 10 gigatons of carbon removal per year and 20 gigatons of carbon CO2 removal per year from 2050 to 2100. And so what we also concluded is that in order to achieve those carbon removal targets, not one technology or approach is going to do everything. And more recently, we've also seen reversibilities of some of the nature-based storage approaches to carbon, like in wildfires, for instance. And so it's really important to think about the total goal and that not one approach is going to be the solution. And so I say that because when we think about the oil companies and their skill set today has really been associated with petrochemicals, how fluids move in the subsurface and porous media, like sedimentary basins, and recovering oil and gas. And then really to take care of the gigaton challenge, of course, the nature-based solutions are going to play a role, but we're going to really have to put that accumulated CO2 from the atmosphere back in the earth. And it's going to be very similar jobs to the recovery of oil and gas that will be required to put that CO2 back. And so that I think is an important factor. The other question, the other part of the question, I answered associated with a current federal tax credit that exists today called 45Q. And with 45Q, the way that it's written today is you can max out at $35 per ton of CO2 removal if the CO2 is used, for instance, for enhanced oil recovery. But it maxes out at about $50 per ton if it's for dedicated storage of CO2. And my feeling is that gap between $35 and $50 is much too narrow. And so what that means is that there's not a lot of economic incentive to do carbon removal coupled to dedicated storage. And it forces companies to couple with enhanced oil recovery because they can get oil out and then make a profit from that. And we've seen more recently that when we see the fluctuation of oil, it actually causes some carbon capture projects to shut down. And we saw that recently in Texas with a project called Petronova. And it's not that the carbon capture is not working, it's just that when it's tied to oil and the price of oil, there's a sensitivity to that and a risk. And so by increasing the gap between coupling storage with EOR to dedicated storage, I think could be a strategy so that we're not enabling fossil production.
Great. Thank you so much, Dr. Wilcox. So we had a few questions about methanotrophs and questions about methane and kind of is our understanding of methane adequate to answer some of these questions. So I'm wondering, the person who I think was asking this question isn't here with us anymore, but if I could expand it to some of the other questions around undercounting of certain greenhouse gases, maybe kind of not having a full picture of methane or nitrous oxide. If Ben or Dipti or Jen, if any of you guys want to take on this question of like, what are our big data gaps around greenhouse gases with agriculture, and how do we get better data to plug some of those holes?
Yeah, probably I can take that first. I think when it comes to data gaps, it comes to, okay, how much of methane is coming from either the livestock sector or from soils or from plants, such as paddy, and so on. So expressing amount of methane coming from different environments is key. And there is so much of variability in these numbers because the effect of the environment or the cultivars or the host has a big effect on how much of methane is coming. Plus the seasonality effects have to be considered in trying to get a sense of what sort of different greenhouse gases are coming out. With the new technologies, I think we have the capability to measure different greenhouse gases. That's number one. And then when it comes to knowledge gaps, particularly from my end, 70% of some of these emissions, particularly methane, comes from microbes. And there are different sort of methanogens out there that are so different, either in ruminants or in soils or in anaerobic digesters and so on, that contribute differently to methane emissions. By having a better understanding of these different microbes and what substrates actually contribute to the formation of methane or different greenhouse gases will help us to find novel ways to reduce without affecting the other microbes or the microbial symbiosis and the overall functionality of different ecosystems. And then coming to methanotrophs, as I said, there's a strong competition that exists between different microbes, and it's not so easy to replace one microbial niche with the other. So we need to understand the interactions much better and the factors that govern these different microbes is necessary. And within ruminants or within rice varieties or different things, there's a natural variation, and we need to understand what are the variations and what factors account for these variations to come up with natural ways of reducing methane emissions or greenhouse gases emissions overall.
Great. Ben, do you want to talk a little bit about aerobic versus anaerobic environments on the farm, and how we should think about that research, but also that set of practices?
Yes, I'd like to first just explain that I'm not a methane expert, and that the microbes that Dipti is studying are the essential link of how methane is generated or broken down. But what we do is we use eddy covariance and also gas flux chambers to monitor methane at different sites. And I can share the general trends we've seen that are informing the next steps of our research. One is that when on our more well-drained soils, where we don't really get anaerobic conditions, we see much lower methane emissions from the soil. And really down to a negligible level, where the methane readings we get are basically what's there in the atmosphere on our eddy covariance tower. And we have also seen when we get heavy rain events on our heavy soil research sites, we get spikes in methane production from those soils. And then we also, in our initial using our gas flux chamber on wet manure versus compost, we see we see a lot more methane being produced in wet manure. In our compost, we see very little. And then in our initial eddy covariance grazing studies, we've seen on the pasture slight upticks in methane with the cows out there grazing, but not as high as we would have expected based on what the cows were producing in the barn. So we're hypothesizing that some of that methane is being broken down in the grassland. But where we are not experts and where research is critical, and in all the areas Dipti explained, is understanding what the microbial profiles are in these environments and what are their roles in either producing or destroying methane. So for us, we're looking at the macro research of what was methane production like in relation to a set of practices used. But we're not getting as granular as the biological element. And I feel like both sets of research are critical. One is sort of the initial understanding what systems produce the least methane or potentially destroy the most, and then getting down to the granular level of why and how.
Great. Well, I think we should acknowledge that we're almost at 4 o'clock. And so if some of the panelists need to run, want to give them a chance to sign off and to thank them. If any of the other panelists have a chance to stay on for a few more minutes, please let me know, and then we can ask a few more questions for some more minutes.
Thank you, Alden and Jennifer. We really loved having you here today. If you have any last words, feel free to.
It was fun, and please let's find ways to keep up the dialogue. I think there's lots we could all do together.
Absolutely. Thank you.
I just want to say thanks for having me today, and it's really exciting to get to learn about everybody else's work in this space, not just the engineered approaches, but the nature-based ones too. And just to emphasize that I think all approaches will be required because we've got some challenging days ahead with carbon removal. So thanks again.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thanks for putting this together. Thank you so much.
Yeah, I really appreciate the opportunity as well. And it's wonderful to be part of a group of panelists. And I just want to echo that all of these approaches together are all needed to address these issues. And it was really, I thought, a good selection of panelists. So we all from different areas that all connect. So it's really interesting to see the connection points. And thank you, everybody.
Thank you again so much to all of the panelists that joined us today for your wonderful work and research. And to all the attendees who joined us for this fascinating conversation.